What's up, y'all? And welcome back to the Invisible Dad podcast. If you're here, chances are you're one of those dads who keeps showing up, even when it feels like nobody's really paying attention. You do what you're supposed to do, you handle your responsibilities, you love your kids, but most of the time, there's no applause for that, no thank yous, no real acknowledgement. You just keep it moving. So today I want to talk about something that doesn't always feel great to hear, but it matters more than we like to admit, and that's accountability. Now, before you tune me out, just hear me out. Okay. When most of us hear the word accountability, we don't typically think of anything positive. We think about being blamed, being called out, or being told what we're doing wrong. We think about the courtrooms and the arguments, the lectures, or just someone always keeping score. And that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about the kind of accountability that happens when nobody else is around, the kind that shows up when you're tired and frustrated or discouraged, and you still choose to handle things the right way. Because here's the truth. Being a dad means you don't always get the benefit of the doubt, and if you're co-parenting or dealing with a tough situation, it can feel like everyone is watching and just waiting for you to mess up, all while ignoring how much you actually do right. That can make accountability feel unfair. Like, why do I have to be the one holding myself together all the time? I felt that, and I'm sure you have too. But I've also learned this. Accountability isn't about beating yourself up. It's about being honest with yourself, about owning your choices, your reactions, and your energy, especially when things aren't going your way. It's easy to be a good dad when everything's calm and when schedules line up, when the communication is smooth, when life isn't throwing you curveballs. The real test is how you show up when life gets messy, when plans change at the last minute, when you don't get the time that you hope for, when you feel ignored and dismissed and pushed aside. See, that's where accountability lives, not in being perfect, but in being consistent. Our kids are watching more than we realize, not in some dramatic like spotlight type of way, but just in the everyday stuff, how we talk, how we respond when we're frustrated, whether we keep our word, whether we own it when we mess up. And here's the part that's tough to swallow. Like, you don't get to outsource that. You can't hand accountability off to a schedule. You can't blame it on a co-parent. You can't wait for life to get easier first. At the end of the day, how you show up is on you. And that might sound heavy, but for me, like, I actually think it's freeing because accountability means, you still have control over something. Even when it feels like everything else is out of your hands, you may not control the situation, but you control your response to it. And that matters. So in this episode, I want to break down what accountability really looks like for dads who feel unseen. Not the TikTok version, not the motivational poster version, the real life version. We're going to talk about why accountability matters more than being perfect, why your kids don't need you to get it right every time. They need you to be honest and steady, and how staying accountable to yourself builds trust with your kids, even when the situation around you feels unfair or out of balance. This isn't about guilt. It's not about shame. It's not about being harder on yourself. It's about becoming more solid, because the dad who holds himself accountable doesn't drift. He doesn't disappear. He doesn't let frustration turn into distance. He shows up even when it's uncomfortable. And that's the kind of dad kids remember. So if you've ever felt like you're carrying more than people realize, if you've ever felt like, you're expected to stay calm while everything around you just feels like it's falling apart, if you've ever wondered whether what you're doing actually matters, hey, this one's for you. So let's get into it. Let's start at the root of all of this, and that's owning your role as a father. And I don't mean the version that sounds good on paper. I mean the real everyday version, the one that shows up when things aren't ideal, when the time is limited, when communication is hard, when you're tired and frustrated and feeling like you're doing more than people realize. Owning your role is the foundation of accountability. And here's the part a lot of us struggle with at first. No matter what the circumstances are, your role as a dad is still yours. You don't get to hand it off. You don't get to outsource it. And you don't get to blame someone else for the impact you have on your child. That doesn't mean everything is your fault. It just means how you show up is your responsibility. Owning your role doesn't mean you're perfect. It doesn't mean you won't mess up. It doesn't mean you won't lose patience or feel overwhelmed or have days where you wish things were just easier. It just means you stop pretending that your influence depends on the situation being fair. And a lot of dads get stuck here. Like, we tell ourselves, well, if only I had more time, or if communication was better, or if things were different, I could really show up. And that mindset feels understandable sometimes, but it keeps you waiting instead of acting. Owning your role means saying, this is the situation, this is the time I have, and this is what I'm going to do with it. And that shift matters. One of the biggest ways this shows up is in consistency. When you have your child, how do you show up? Not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. Are you present, or are you distracted? Are you steady, or are you carrying frustration into the room? Are you predictable, or does your energy change depending on how the week went? Kids don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be reliable. Even if you only have them a few days a month, those days matter a lot. And the version of you that shows up during that time leaves an impression, whether you realize it or not. And consistency doesn't mean being boring. It means being familiar. It means your child knows what to expect from you, your tone, your routines, your reactions. And when kids know what to expect, they feel safe. And that's not a small thing. And another part of owning your role is intentionality. And no, that doesn't mean planning something amazing every minute you're together. It means not letting time slip by on autopilot. It's easy to fall into that trap, especially when you feel pressure to make the most of limited time. Some dads go into overdrive trying to pack everything into one day. Others shut down and just let the time pass. And neither one really helps. Intentionality looks more like this, being present on purpose, reading that book even when you're tired, sitting on the floor even when your back hurts, watching the same show over and over again because it makes them laugh. The small things is just repeat it. Those moments send a clear message. I'm here, I'm paying attention, and you matter. And kids pick up on that way more than we think. Another part of owning your role, and this one's uncomfortable, it's the reflection part. Like after a visit, after a call, after a tough moment, you have to be willing to ask yourself a few questions. How did I handle that? What worked? What didn't? Did I react or did I respond? What do I want to do differently next time? That's not self-criticism. That's growth. Accountability isn't about beating yourself up. It's about learning from what just happened instead of acting like it didn't matter. Owning your role also means taking responsibility for how you respond when things don't go your way. And maybe the schedule changes. Maybe communication breaks down. Maybe you feel like your voice isn't being heard. All of that is real. All of that is frustrating, and we've all experienced it. But the way you respond in those moments matters more than the situation itself. Do you carry that frustration into your time with your child? Do you let it show up as tension and distraction or distance? Or do you deal with it privately so your child gets the best version of you? See, that's a choice, and it's part of owning your role. And another big piece is being honest with your words and promises. Like, don't overpromise. Don't try to make up for lost time by doing too much. Kids don't need big gestures. They need your word to mean something. And being reliable builds trust faster than anything else. And here's the truth that took me a while to accept. Owning your role doesn't make fatherhood easier. It makes it real. You stop blaming, you stop waiting, you stop wishing things were different before you show up fully. You start acting with intention. You start building something solid. You start leading from where you are and not where you wish you were. And your child notices that. Maybe not right away, maybe not in obvious ways, but they do feel it. They feel the steadiness. They feel the effort, and the love that shows up consistently. That's what accountability looks like in real life. It's not perfection. It's not control, just ownership. And that's something no one can take away. All right, let's talk about something that a lot of dads don't realize they're struggling with until it's already wearing them down. And that's the difference between accountability and approval, because those two things get mixed up fast, especially when you're co-parenting or when your role feels constantly like it's under a microscope. At some point, a lot of us start chasing approval without even meaning to. Approval from that other parent, approval from the court or from the family or teachers and coaches or just people around you, And the wild part is we usually tell ourselves we're doing it for the kids. But if we're being honest, a lot of that chasing comes from wanting to be seen as a good dad, not just being one. And I've been there. You start explaining yourself more than you need to. You start softening decisions that don't need softening. You hesitate before doing normal dad stuff because you're thinking, is this going to be a problem? Right? That's approval seeking, and it's exhausting. Accountability and approval are not the same thing, but they can feel really similar when you're in the middle of it. Accountability is about holding yourself to a standard. Approval is about hoping someone else agrees with it. And here's the difference that changed everything for me. Accountability asks, am I doing what's right for my child? Approval asks, will this make someone else upset? Those questions lead to very different decisions. When you're living for approval, you start parenting defensively. You're not leading, you're reacting. You're trying to avoid conflict instead of building consistency. And that's not because you're weak, it's just because you're tired. A lot of dads get stuck here because it feels like approval is the currency of peace. Like, if you can just keep everyone happy, things will go smoother. But the truth is, approval is unstable. It changes depending on mood. It changes depending on the power dynamics. It changes depending on who feels threatened that day. You can do everything right and still not get approval. And that's a hard lesson to accept. I had to come to terms with the fact that there were situations where no amount of calm communication, respect, or logic was ever going to lead to approval. And once I accepted that, I had a choice to make. I could keep bending myself into knots trying to earn it, or I could anchor myself in accountability and let approval fall where it may. That doesn't mean becoming difficult. It doesn't mean being careless. It definitely doesn't mean acting out of spite. It means getting really, really clear about who you're accountable to. And at the end of the day, that's a really short list. You're accountable to God. You're accountable to your child. You're accountable to your values, and you're accountable to the dad you want to be when you look back on this season of life. That's it. You're not accountable for someone else's comfort. You're not accountable for someone else's need for control, and you're not accountable for how someone chooses to interpret your intentions. Once I started parenting from accountability instead of approval, things shifted internally. Even when nothing changed externally, I stopped over-explaining. I stopped pre-defending normal decisions. I stopped measuring my actions by how they might be received. Instead, I started asking myself simpler questions. Is this safe? Is this reasonable? Is this loving? Would I stand by this decision if no one else ever agreed with it? If the answer was yes, I move forward. And that's accountability. And here's the thing. Accountability doesn't guarantee peace with other adults, but it does create peace within yourself. You sleep better, you second guess less, you show up calmer, and your kids feel that. Kids don't need a dad who's constantly checking the temperature of the room. They need a dad who feels solid and predictable and grounded. Approval seeking makes you unstable. Accountability makes you steady. And another trap dads fall into is thinking that accountability means being hard on yourself all the time. And it doesn't. Accountability is actually pretty practical. It means admitting when you mess up and fixing it. It means owning your reactions instead of blaming the situation. It means saying, I didn't handle that the way I wanted to. I'll do better next time. That's not weakness. That's leadership. And here's something important. Your kids don't need you to be approved by everyone else in their life. They just need you to be consistent. They need to know that when they're with you, they're safe. That your rules don't change based on who's watching. That your love doesn't depend on circumstances. That kind of consistency builds trust, not approval. There's also a freedom that comes with letting go of approval. You stop arguing with reality. You stop trying to win every interaction. You stop carrying resentment that leaks into your time with your kids. That doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care about the right things. And sometimes accountability looks like choosing not to engage, not because you're scared, not because you're avoiding responsibility, but because you know that engaging won't move anything forward. Silence can be accountability. Boundaries can be accountability. Staying calm can be accountability. At the end of the day, approval is optional. Accountability is not. You don't need anyone's permission to be a present, loving, and intentional dad. You don't need validation to show up consistently. You don't need agreement to lead with integrity. Your child isn't grading you on how agreeable you are. They're learning from how steady you are. And years from now, they won't remember who approved your decisions. They'll remember that you showed up, that you were there, that you were solid. And that's accountability. All right, now let's talk about accountability when it actually gets hard, because being accountable is easy when things are calm, when everyone's communicating, and when the schedules make sense, when you're not frustrated or tired or feeling pushed to the edge. The real test of accountability is what you do in those tough situations. And every dad has them. The moments where plans fall apart at the last minute, the moments where, you don't get the time that you hope for, the moments where you feel ignored and dismissed or treated like you don't matter. Those are the moments that expose how you really handle pressure. Because here's the truth. Tough situations don't just test your patience. They test your identity as a father. They poke at your pride. They poke at your sense of fairness. They poke at that part of you that wants to say, this isn't right. And a lot of the time, you're not wrong. But accountability isn't about whether the situation is fair. It's about how you choose to show up anyway. And I had to learn this slowly. Like, when things got hard, my instinct was always to defend myself, to explain, to make sure that my side was understood. Not in a disrespectful way, but in a determined way. Because when you know you're a good dad, being questioned hits deep. It feels personal. So I tried to reason things out calmly and logically and respectfully. I tell myself, if I could just explain this clearly enough, it'll land. And most times it didn't. Right? And here's the realization that changed how I handled these tough situations. Some situations are not problems to solve. They're realities to manage. And once I accepted that, accountability took on a different shape. It stopped being about fixing everything. It stopped being about changing someone else's mind. It became about controlling the one thing I actually had control over, and that was myself. Accountability in tough situations starts with emotional regulation. And that sounds simple, but it's not. It means noticing when your chest gets tight, when your thoughts speed up, when you feel that urge to fire back a message or prove a point, and then choosing not to. Not because you're weak and not because you don't care, but because you care too much about the long game. I had to ask myself a hard question more than once. If my son was watching this moment, would I be proud of how I'm handling it? And that question alone stopped me from making a lot of choices I would have regretted. Accountability doesn't mean swallowing everything or pretending you're fine when you're not. It means handling your emotions somewhere safe and not dumping them into the situation that already feels tense. Sometimes that looks like stepping away before responding. Sometimes it looks like writing the message and not sending it. Sometimes it looks like calling a friend instead of engaging. That's not avoidance. That's discipline. And another part of accountability in tough situations is accepting limits. And that's one of the hardest parts of fatherhood. There are limits to what you can change, limits to what you can negotiate, limits to what you can influence. And fighting those limits over and over again doesn't make you more involved. It just exhausts you. I had to learn that accountability doesn't require me to fight every battle. It requires me to choose the right ones. Asking myself, is this about my child's safety? Is this about their long-term well-being? Or is this about my frustration in the moment? And those questions matter, because when everything feels like a fight, nothing gets your best energy. Accountability also shows up in how you handle disappointment. There are times when things don't go the way you hoped, when you don't get that extra time, when the answer is no again and again and again. Those moments hurt. And it's tempting to let that disappointment, turn into distance, to pull back emotionally, to show up less because it feels pointless. And that's where accountability asks you to do the opposite, to stay engaged, to stay present, to keep showing up with the same steadiness as before. Not because it's easy, but because your child shouldn't feel the weight of adult frustration. Your kid doesn't need to know how hard it was to get the time. They just need to feel that when they're with you, you're there. Another tough situation dads face is when we mess up, because we do. We lose patience. We say something a little harsher than we meant to. We react instead of responding sometimes. Accountability in those moments isn't about excuses. It's about repair, saying, hey, I shouldn't have reacted like that. Own it and just do better next time. That teaches your child something powerful, that mistakes don't end relationships. They're opportunities to grow. And here's something important. Accountability doesn't mean you carry everything alone. Tough situations are heavier when you isolate yourself. When you don't talk about them, when you pretend they're not affecting you. Sometimes accountability looks like just having the courage to ask for support, like talking things through with someone you trust, like learning better tools for handling stress and conflict. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. And at the end of the day, accountability in tough situations comes down to this. You can't control the situation, but you can control the version of yourself that shows up inside it. You can show up bitter, you can show up reactive, or you can show up grounded. Your child will feel the difference. They won't remember every tough situation. They won't remember every disagreement or missed opportunity, but they will remember how you made them feel when things were hard. Did you stay calm? Did you stay present? Did you keep showing up? That's accountability where it matters most. Not when it's easy, but when it's hard. And that's what builds real trust over time. All right, let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention when we talk about accountability, and that's burnout. Because a lot of dads don't quit showing up because they don't care. They burn out because they care too much and don't know how to pace themselves. Accountability sounds good on paper. Show up, be consistent, do the work. But if you're not careful, that mindset can quietly turn into pressure. And pressure to always be calm, always be available, always be the bigger person, always be steady, even when you're running on fumes. And that's not sustainable. I've had to learn that accountability doesn't mean draining yourself dry. It doesn't mean sacrificing your mental health or pretending you're fine when you're not. It means learning how to show up in a way that you can maintain. Because here's the truth. A burned out dad isn't an effective one. You might still be physically present, but emotionally, you're checked out, short-tempered, distracted, carrying resentment you don't want your kids to feel. And kids feel that stuff. Burnout usually sneaks in quietly. It shows up when you start dreading conversations you used to handle fine. When every request feels like a demand, when you replay situations over and over in your head and you can't shut it off. That's not weakness, that's overload. Accountability without burnout starts with recognizing your limits and respecting them. A lot of dads think acknowledging limits means, lowering the bar, and it doesn't. It means setting a bar you can actually reach consistently. You don't have to be everything every time. You don't have to respond immediately to every message. You don't have to solve every problem today. You don't have to carry every frustration alone. Sometimes accountability looks like just taking a step back on purpose so you don't blow up later. And I had to learn that being accountable doesn't mean engaging with everything that comes my way. Some things don't deserve my energy, not because they don't matter, but because engaging would cost me peace without changing the outcome. And that's not avoidance, that's wisdom. Another big part of avoiding burnout is learning to separate your role as a dad from the conflict around it. Those two things get tangled up fast. When you're constantly dealing with tension, it's easy to start associating fatherhood with stress. Like being a dad always comes with friction and arguments or disappointment. And that's dangerous. Your kids shouldn't feel like your time together is heavy. They shouldn't feel like you're carrying a weight into the room. So sometimes accountability means dealing with adult stuff away from your kids, not pretending it doesn't exist, but not letting it bleed into your time with them. And that might mean, going for a drive to clear your head, or just writing things down instead of saying them out loud, talking to someone, or just giving yourself a minute before responding. None of that makes you less accountable. It makes you more regulated. And another thing I've had to work on is letting go of the idea that accountability means always being on. You're allowed to be tired. You're allowed to have off days. You're allowed to need a break. What matters is that you just don't disappear. Burnout happens when dads feel like they only have two options: either go all out or give up. But there's a middle ground, and that's staying steady and sustainable and just giving that consistent effort. Showing up doesn't always look impressive. Sometimes it's boring, and boring is okay. Boring is routines. It's consistency. Boring is being there even when nothing exciting is happening. Another key to avoiding burnout is redefining what doing enough actually means. A lot of dads are carrying this invisible scoreboard in their head, counting the missed time, the missed moments, missed chances, trying to make up for everything all at once. And that pressure will crush you. You don't need to make up for the past. You need to show up in the present. Accountability is about today, this moment, this interaction, not some imaginary version of fatherhood you think you should be living. One thing that helped me was giving myself permission to be human, to admit when something is hard, to acknowledge frustration without letting it control me, to stop expecting myself to carry everything perfectly. That didn't make me weaker as a dad. It made me more grounded. And here's something important. Accountability includes taking care of yourself. That doesn't mean checking out. It means staying healthy enough to keep showing up. Like sleep matters, support matters, mental health matters. You're not selfish for protecting your energy. You're responsible because your kids don't need a dad who's constantly exhausted and resentful. They need one who's steady and present, even if that means doing a little less, but doing it consistently. Burnout also comes from feeling like nothing you do is noticed, and that's hard. But accountability means showing up even when the recognition isn't there, not because you're invisible, but because you're invested. And here's the part that helped me reframe it. My job isn't to feel appreciated every day. My job is to be reliable. Appreciation might come later, but impact comes now. At the end of the day, accountability without burnout looks like this. You care, but you don't carry everything. You show up, but you pace yourself. You stay consistent without destroying your peace. That balance takes practice, but once you find it, fatherhood stops feeling like survival of the fittest and starts feeling sustainable. And that's how you stay in the game long term. All right, now let's talk about something that doesn't get said enough. How accountability actually gets passed down. Because here's the truth. You don't teach accountability by talking about it. You teach it by living it. You know, your kids are watching what you do way more closely than they're listening to what you say. They're paying attention to how you handle stress, how you respond when things don't go your way, how you act when you're tired, frustrated, and disappointed. That's where the real lessons happen. You know, and a lot of dads think teaching accountability means sitting their kids down and explaining things, giving speeches, you know, laying out rules, making sure they understand consequences. And that stuff has its place, especially as kids get older, but it's not where accountability really sinks in. You know, it sinks in when they see how you handle yourself when something goes wrong. You know, do you own it or do you blame someone else? You know, when plans change, do you stay steady or do you let frustration take over? When you mess up, do you acknowledge it or do you pretend like it never happened? Kids notice that stuff. And here's the uncomfortable part. They copy it. If they see you avoiding responsibility, they'll learn to do the same thing. If they see you reacting emotionally instead of responding thoughtfully, they'll pick that up too. But if they see you take ownership calmly and consistently, that becomes their blueprint. You know, I've had to check myself on this more than once. You know, there have been moments where I lost my patience, where I snapped a little quicker than I wanted to, where I realized afterward, you know, that wasn't my best. Accountability in those moments isn't pretending it didn't happen. It's stopping, you know, getting down on their level and saying something simple like, hey, I shouldn't have talked like that. You know, that's on me. No excuses, no justifications, no blame shifting, just ownership. And that might feel uncomfortable at first, but I've learned something important. Owning your mistakes doesn't weaken your authority. It strengthens it. Your kids learn that accountability isn't about punishment. It's about honesty and repair. And that lesson sticks. Another way we teach accountability is through follow through. Kids hear promises all the time. What they remember is which ones get kept. You know, if you say you're going to call, call. If you say you'll be there, be there. If you say something is going to happen, make it happen. That doesn't mean you never have to change plans. You know, life happens. But when it does, explaining it calmly matters. You know, hey, this didn't work out the way I planned. I know I said I'd do this and I couldn't, and that's on me. That's accountability in real life. And it shows your kids that responsibility isn't about being perfect, it's about being honest. Another thing kids learn by watching us is how we handle rules. If rules change depending on your mood, kids learn that structure doesn't mean much. But if rules are consistent, even when it's inconvenient, they learn that boundaries matter. It doesn't mean being rigid or harsh, it means being predictable. When your kids know what to expect from you, they feel safe, and safety creates respect. Accountability also shows up in how you talk about other people, and especially the other parent. Kids are incredibly sensitive to that one. They can feel tension. They can fear frustration. They can sense that resentment. Modeling accountability sometimes means choosing your words carefully, not because you're hiding the truth, but because you're protecting your child from adult baggage that they don't need to carry. You can be honest without being bitter. You can be firm without being cruel. You can stand your ground without dragging your child into conflict. That restraint teaches accountability too, because your kids learn that being responsible sometimes means not saying everything that you feel. Another powerful way we teach accountability is through effort. Kids notice when you show up, even when it's inconvenient, when you keep routines, when you stay involved in their lives, even when circumstances make it harder. They might not thank you for it now. They may not even recognize it, but they internalize it. They learn that responsibility isn't conditional, that you don't disappear when things get hard, that showing up is something you do, not something you talk about. And that lesson carries weight. And here's something I think a lot of dads need to hear. You don't have to be a perfect example to be a powerful one. Your kids don't need you to get it right every single time. They need you to be real enough to own it when you don't. That's what accountability looks like in real life. It's not flawless behavior. It's consistent ownership. It's showing your kids that responsibility isn't scary. It's not about shame. It's about integrity. And over time, that shapes how they see themselves. They learn I can make mistakes and fix them. I can be honest when I mess up. I can take responsibility without falling apart. And that's a gift. At the end of the day, your kids won't remember every rule you set or every lecture that you gave. They'll remember how you handled yourself. They'll remember whether you showed up, whether you owned your actions, whether you stayed steady. And when they face tough situations of their own one day, they'll fall back on what they saw modeled at home. That's how accountability gets passed down, quietly, consistently, and by example. All right, dads, let's slow this down for a second and bring it home. We've talked a lot today about accountability, what it looks like, what it costs, and why it matters, especially when nobody's clapping for you, when things feel unfair, or when you're doing the work quietly. But here's the bigger picture I want you to sit with before we wrap this up. What you're doing right now isn't just about getting through today or this season. It's about the example you're setting, whether you realize it or not. Every choice you make, every moment you decide to own your actions instead of dodging them, is shaping something your child will carry with them long after this chapter ends. Accountability isn't something your kids just hear about. It's something they absorb. They're watching how you handle mistakes. They're watching how you respond when things don't go your way. They're watching whether you follow through, whether you apologize, whether you show up when it's inconvenient. And over time, all of that adds up. A child who grows up seeing their dad own his stuff calmly, honestly, without excuses, learns something powerful. They learn that responsibility isn't about shame, that mistakes don't make you weak, that integrity is something you live out, not something you talk about. That becomes their default. And that's how generational patterns change, not through big speeches, not through perfect parenting, but through consistent, everyday ownership. I've had to learn this myself. There was a time when I realized I was reacting defensively in tough situations, especially when I felt misunderstood or challenged. And if I'm being honest, that reaction looked a lot like things I grew up seeing. It was familiar and automatic. But once I noticed it, I had a choice. I could keep reacting the same way, or I could slow down, take responsibility for my responses, and choose something different. That didn't mean everything suddenly got easier. It didn't mean conflict disappeared, but it did change the tone of my presence. My kids felt it. Things felt steadier and safer. And that's when it clicked for me. Accountability isn't about being perfect. It's about being reliable. It's about showing up the same way over and over, even when it's hard, even when no one's watching, even when you're tired. That's the kind of consistency that kids internalize. So if you're wondering how to build that kind of legacy, don't overthink it. It's in the small stuff, the details, keeping your word, being on time, owning it when you mess up, repairing instead of pretending nothing happened. Those moments teach more than any lecture ever could. Your kids may not be able to put it into words right now. They may not thank you for it. They may not even notice it in the moment, but they are watching. Every apology is planting a seed. Every follow through is planting a seed. Every moment you choose integrity over ego is planting a seed. And those seeds grow. They grow into trust, into resilience. They grow into adults who take responsibility for their lives and their relationships. So here's my challenge to you. Just one simple thing. Today, do one intentional act of accountability. Follow through on something you've been putting off. Own a moment you could have handled better. Pause before reacting and choose a calmer response. One small choice, because those small choices compound. And dads, that's the real gift you're giving your kids. Not money, not stuff, not even time by itself. You're giving them a model for how to live. And that's legacy. This is the Invisible Dad Podcast. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And thank you for being here. And as always, I see you, I hear you, and I appreciate you. Till next time, keep showing up. Peace.